February 12, 2009. A federal bankruptcy court in Delaware. Midway Games, the company that brought Pac-Man to America, that created Mortal Kombat, that once pulled $1 billion in quarters in a single year, filed for Chapter 11 protection with more than $240 million in debt. 3 months earlier, the man who owned 80% of the company sold his entire stake for $100,000. Not $100 million, not $10 million, $100,000. Another empire, another case. Here's what really happened. Midway Manufacturing was not born in a garage with a dream. It was born in 1958 as an amusement company making bowling games and shuffle alleys. Henry Johnston and Marcine Wolverton were not chasing the future of entertainment. They were building machines that sat in bars and truck stops and took quarters from people with nothing better to do. For more than a decade, that was enough. Then, in 1969, Bally Manufacturing, one of the largest pinball and slot machine companies in the world, acquired Midway and folded it into its gaming empire. Midway became Bally's vehicle for the arcade push that was coming, whether anyone was ready for it or not. The first hint of what Midway could become arrived in 1975. Gunfight, the first arcade game ever powered by a microprocessor. Midway didn't design it. They licensed it from Taito, the Japanese company that had already figured out the technology, and brought it to American arcades. That pattern, finding the best thing someone else built and putting it in front of American audiences, would define Midway for the next decade. In 1978, Taito released Space Invaders in Japan. The game generated lines around the block. Midway secured the American distribution rights and brought the invasion stateside. American arcades changed overnight. Then, in 1980, Namco released Pac-Man. Midway secured American distribution again. What followed was not just a hit, it was a cultural detonation. Pac-Man became the highest-grossing arcade game in American history. Midway's name was on the cabinet. Namco's game was inside it. Midway had discovered something most companies never figure out. You don't have to create the empire, you just have to be the one who delivers it to the door. Miss Pac-Man did not come from Namco. It came from a Massachusetts company called General Computer Corporation, who built an unauthorized modification kit for the original Pac-Man cabinet called Crazy Otto. They changed the characters, added new mazes, and sold the mod directly to arcade operators without asking Namco for permission. Midway bought the kit from GCC, rebranded it as Miss Pac-Man, and distributed it across America. It outsold the original. Namco found out after the fact. The legal web that followed took decades to partially untangle, and Miss Pac-Man still disappears from modern Namco retrospectives, because nobody can cleanly explain who actually owns it. That was 1981. What came next made everything before it look small. In 1992, two Midway developers named Ed Boon and John Tobias built a fighting game using digitized photographs of real actors instead of hand-drawn sprites. The characters bled. They could rip each other's spines out. They could tear hearts from chests while they were still beating. The game was called Mortal Kombat, and it was unlike anything anyone had ever seen in an arcade. The controversy was immediate and enormous. Parents were furious. Politicians held hearings. In 1993, Senators Joseph Lieberman and Herb Kohl called the video game industry before Congress to answer for what they had created. Midway sat in those hearings, while legislators demanded the industry police itself. The result was the Entertainment Software Rating Board, or ESRB, the content rating system that appears on every video game sold in America to this day. Midway didn't create it intentionally. They created the game that made it inevitable. Meanwhile, NBA Jam arrived in 1993. 2-on-2 basketball with no fouls, no rules, and players who caught fire when they scored 3 baskets in a row. NBA Jam pulled over $1 billion in quarters in its first year. $1 billion from a single arcade game. At its peak, Midway was not just an arcade company, it was the arcade company, the name on machines that defined American youth culture for a generation. The home console was not supposed to kill the arcade. For years, the two coexist. You played the arcade version because it was better. You bought the home version because you wanted it at midnight in your bedroom. Then the PlayStation arrived. Then the Nintendo 64. Then the Dreamcast. By the late 1990s, home consoles were matching arcade hardware. The gap closed, and then it closed completely. Arcade foot traffic didn't slow down, it collapsed. Midway shut its arcade manufacturing division entirely in 2001. The problem was that everything Midway knew how to do was built for 3-minute experiences designed to extract quarters. Their developers were masters of the hook, the immediate rush, the loop that made you put in another coin. They had no institutional knowledge for building a 30-hour narrative experience for someone sitting alone in their bedroom. The console games that followed were expensive, slow to develop, and frequently disappointing. Stranglehold, a 2007 action game budgeted at tens of millions, underperformed. This is Vegas, a Las Vegas open-world game that cost an estimated $40 to $50 million to develop, was canceled without ever releasing a single copy. The money was gone, and there was nothing to show for it. In 2002, Midway posted a net loss of $117 million. In 2007, after years of restructuring, they posted a net loss of $97 million. The losses never stopped. They just changed size. In 2004, a media billionaire named Sumner Redstone, the man who controlled Viacom and CBS, bought a controlling interest in Midway and injected hundreds of millions of dollars into the company. For a moment, it looked like a rescue, but it wasn't. What Redstone did 4 years later would trigger the signal event that ended Midway permanently. In late 2008, Sumner Redstone sold his 87% stake in Midway Games to a private investor named Mark Thomas for $100,000. The number requires a moment. Redstone had poured hundreds of millions into the company. He sold his controlling stake, the majority ownership of one of the most historically significant arcade companies ever built, for $100,000. It was a tax loss maneuver. He needed the write-off more than he needed the company. What he didn't tell Mark Thomas, or what Thomas didn't fully account for, was the change of control clause buried in Midway's debt covenants. The moment ownership transferred, bondholders had the legal right to demand immediate repayment of $150 million in accelerated debt. Midway did not have $150 million. Midway barely had next month's payroll. On February 12, 2009, Midway Games filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in Delaware, with more than $240 million in total accumulated debt. In July 2009, Warner Brothers Interactive Entertainment purchased the majority of Midway's assets for $33 million. The Mortal Kombat franchise, the Chicago studio, the legacy arcade IPs, including Joust, Spy Hunter, and Defender. $33 million for 50 years of history. The Chicago studio did not close. Warner Brothers rebranded it NetherRealm Studios and handed it back to Ed Boon. NetherRealm went on to produce modern Mortal Kombat franchise, the Injustice series, and some of the best fighting games of the last 15 years. The empire Midway built around that one franchise outlived the company that created it by decades. Mark Turmel, the architect of NBA Jam, landed at EA Sports and directed the NBA Jam revival in 2010. Eugene Jarvis, the designer behind Defender and Robotron, had already seen this coming. He founded Raw Thrills in 2001 and built it into the dominant force in modern arcade manufacturing. The man who made games for the arcade era that died built the company keeping the arcade alive today. And Tony Goski, the background artist who hand-painted the courtyard, the pit, and the living forest, the environments that gave Mortal Kombat its atmosphere, its weight, its sense that something genuinely dangerous was happening on that screen, never got the credit that Boone and Tobias received. He painted the world that made people believe the characters were real. His name appears in almost none of the retrospectives. Midway never owned Pac-Man. They never owned Space Invaders. They built one of the most profitable arcade empires in history on games they distributed, not games they created. When they finally built something that was entirely theirs, Mortal Kombat, it outlived the company by decades and is still generating hundreds of millions of dollars a year under someone else's roof. The middleman who becomes indispensable is only safe until the thing they were in the middle of disappears. The arcade disappeared. Midway didn't have a plan for that. The next company in this series did. They saw the crash coming before it arrived and made a decision that the entire industry said was insane. Another empire, another case. Here's what really happened.